Ever wondered how player insights can reshape a game's development? No? Well, I'll talk about it anyway and you can't stop me. Today we're taking a deep dive into a critical playtest I hosted for my game Potion Shop Simulator. We'll also talk about why we find playtesting valuable and why sometimes doing a playtest at all is even more valuable than the results. Before conducting a playtest, there should always be a goal, some things you're actually testing for. In previous playtests, we had been in a test environment testing single mechanics. So for us, the goal was pretty clear. We now want to test the game as a whole. This featured major changes to the game loop, progression, and of course, the entirety of the environment. Some big changes to the gameplay included a new leveling system and reputation system. Essentially, the player gets rewarded with XP for every positive action they take, whether that be plant picking, potion brewing, shopkeeping, or something else. Leveling unlocks items and shop upgrades. Reputation was gained by selling potions to customers and also can be lost if the customers were unhappy. The higher the reputation, the more valuable but also demanding customers would come to your shop. Also, we were introducing the setting of the game, a village inhabited by orcs, goblins and other creatures. Seeing how players responded to these changes would be critical in evaluating our selected direction and understanding how to best present the game to a wider audience. Currently, we've been running closed playtests with friends on our Discord. This approach has both benefits and drawbacks. The main issues are smaller sample size and positive bias. We've been adding a few people for each playtest, but as the testers may not always have time, we tend to get a smaller amount of responses for each. Due to the small number of testers, it's hard to do any meaningful statistical evaluation of the results and therefore have confidence in the numerical results or compare scores from one playtest to another. The positive bias issue is also significant. As these are friends, they will naturally be more positive towards the game and will likely give us more positive feedback and stick with the game longer than the average player. We've tried to screen for overly positive responses with the "would you buy the game in its current state" question. At this stage, if the player says yes, they are likely being too generous, as the game at this point is far from being complete. We also have several game developers as playtesters, and as they are intimately familiar with the playtesting process and the value of objective feedback, they're able to give very valuable responses. Now, what about the benefits and why we chose a small testing group? Well, first of all, the size of the group and familiarity with the participants allow us to ask open-ended questions and take the time to read and analyze all the responses, which would be very time-consuming if we tested with hundreds or thousands of players. The second aspect is simply time. As you can imagine, there are lots of competing tasks when you're working on a game. At this stage, it's important for us to put as much effort into the game itself, and organizing and managing a large playtest would distract from that. As the game becomes more stable and the changes become more incremental, I would like to move to a larger, more open playtest, as that would better suit the game at that time. To get the playtest started, as always the game was uploaded to Steam and announced in our Discord to our playtesters. We set up a feedback form and allowed testers to play the game for about 5 days before the playtest ended. We made sure to stay active in our Discord as well, as some prefer providing feedback there. This also allowed us a better understanding as to how they got to the feedback. This part is more important than you might think. Understanding why a certain piece of feedback is given can often prove very valuable, as more often than not, they got the idea and you didn't, because their understanding of the game is a lot different than yours. But you remember that feedback form I mentioned? Let's dive into that for a second. We firstly asked our testers one fundamental question: did you have fun? And the responses were mostly positive, but varied, with a score distribution showing a clear room for improvement. Throughout the feedback form, we break down the different elements of the game, all in an effort to get a better understanding of the player's experience. To validate that the new XP and reputation systems worked, we asked the players how they understood what the systems did and how they could progress in them. The responses varied quite a bit, from very accurate ones to ones quite less so. With this method, we were able to validate if we were communicating the systems in a way the players could understand. And as this was the first draft, we definitely found improvements to make, such as adding particles to indicate when XP is gained and clearer feedback from the NPCs. As mentioned previously, we've gotten a massive upgrade to our graphics, essentially going from this to now this. The environment was generally well received, with scores ranging from 3 out of 5 to 5 out of 5, leaning more towards the high end of that scale, which was awesome. We also got some super useful feedback, and one we really took to heart was this one, essentially mentioning that it was a weird mix with a human in a monster exclusive world without any further explanation. For us, the setting made sense, as we came up with it and had the backstory in our heads, but of course the player lacks context. Currently we're working with an artist to create an intro cinematic to explain the setting in order to address this issue. Furthermore, for feedback, central to our game is the potion brewing mechanic. And before we get into this feedback, let me briefly explain how the potion brewing works. All elements of this feature are centered around the ingredients in the cauldron. Ingredients have amounts of elements in them, fire, earth, water and air, and the more total elements on the cauldron, the larger the potion. And the more the ratio between the elements matches a potion, the higher the quality of the potion will be, making it a little bit of a puzzle to make a potion. More expensive and rare potions require more interesting combination of elements, making them more difficult to brew. Adding to that, we had a stirring minigame to add to the brewing process to make it a little more engaging. Now going back to the players' feedback, testers generally understood the brewing process, appreciating the elemental puzzle. However, issues arose with the stirring minigame. It was generally seen as repetitive and even provoking motion sickness for some. We're now revisiting the idea of a brewing minigame, but without sacrificing any depth or satisfaction gained from the gameplay. If you have any good ideas for brewing minigames, please share them in the comments. Another critical aspect of the game is the shop management. An important aspect here is one that seems obvious. Players are not developers, meaning there will be a significant skill and knowledge gap between us. People who have worked on the game every day for several months and people who are picking it up for the first time. For something as important as the pacing, it is surprisingly difficult to measure the gap in skill and knowledge from developer to player. Furthermore, as we've been prioritizing implementing features over explaining them, the players could not have full understanding of the mechanics, as we simply haven't fully done the work to properly communicate them. This caused the game to move way too quickly for most players, and gave them the feeling that they were pulled in too many different directions. As you can see on the chart here, we have a lot of 8s and even a 9, which is far from the perfectly balanced score of 5. Feedback generally highlighted a lack of control over customers, sometimes making the game very hectic. This had a big impact on the game's pace and player strategy. Now, this is a very interesting issue, as the general idea of the game was to have players brew potions during the day and run the shop during the night. So we could take this in one of two ways. For one, we embrace the will of the players to have time to do both. And for option 2, we stick to our original plan and find a way to enforce players to only brew during the morning and day, and only run the shop during the evening and night. Now, obviously we want to embrace the natural flow of the game, so we went with option 1. So to address the issue of the pacing, we implemented a new system allowing players to open and close their shop, using this little sign in front of the shop, and thus giving them a little strategic control over the pacing of customers. This has been very well received in follow-up discussions, improving the overall pacing and reducing player stress, essentially landing us new scores of 3s and 4s in the next test. Another interesting element of the game is the more advanced potion recipes. Advanced potions require ingredient manipulation to get the perfect element ratios for a perfect potion, utilizing tools like a mortar and pestle. You get these ingredient manipulators by buying them at the alchemy shop in the village. The shop is unlocked through simply leveling up from playing the game, meaning this is more of a mid to late game aspect. This is an area where I feel like we've dropped the ball. The ingredient manipulation was introduced quite late, and we were highly focused on the early game aspects and the tutorial that guides the player through the main features. And while this was justifiably the focus of the development and the playtest, we spent almost no time testing the late game and ingredient manipulation. We also had an interesting request. In the shop there's a frog in a glass, and people seem to want more from this frog. So I went ahead and made it ribbit occasionally and float around in a flask. I'm thinking of allowing frog customization and other interactions in the future. What do you think that should be added to this frog? Let me know in the comments. All this feedback we received was tremendously valuable, but maybe even more important was conducting a playtest at all. This gave us a deadline, specific features and a goal to strive towards. In preparation we decided what we needed to test, we focused on those features instead of floating around and working in an unstructured way. And having a milestone and a deadline really helped us to also stop and evaluate the game once we reached it. The first playable version of the main environment and game loop was flawed, but as we had implemented it and validated with the players, it allowed us to tweak and improve it for the next test, where it did a whole lot better. Often in development, it's easy to get caught up in the process of creating. Therefore, the chance to take a step back and see the game from a player's eyes is so valuable and should be used as often as possible. Overall, the playtest was very successful, and we're super thankful to anyone who took part and gave their feedback. We also appreciate the support the game is receiving. If you haven't watched the video on 60 days of developing this game, make sure to go give that a watch. Other than that, thank you very much for watching, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.